The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
The Athletic. Hello and welcome to And Colossally That's History, the podcast that casts a critical eye over motor racing history. I'm Matt Bishop, and with me, as always, to remember and reappraise the past is Richard Williams. How are you, Richard? Are you excited about today's episode?
I certainly am, Matt, because we're going to be discussing a man who had a massive impact on not just modern F1, but modern motor racing as a whole. A great champion who was loved by many, but whose methods in achieving victory could be hugely divisive.
They certainly could, yes. In this episode, we're going to be talking about, yes, 7-time Formula One world champion Michael Schumacher, and, more specifically, about how he revolutionized Formula One. Because he did revolutionize Formula One, didn't he, Richard? Or perhaps you disagree?
No, I don't disagree. I think he did revolutionize Formula One in several respects, which we'll go through. One of which was in preparation. I think he took standards of personal preparation for a driver and dedication to the business of preparation to a completely new level that had never been seen before. And he set a new standard, as we'll see, set it for all those who came after him. If you didn't behave like Michael, you weren't going to win any races. I think that's fair enough to say. That's in terms of physical preparation. He also revolutionized the sport in a sense of etiquette on the track. He was the one who really normalized a kind of aggressive behavior that hadn't much been seen in F1 before. One or two drivers, the first world champion, Giuseppe Farina, didn't think twice about cutting up an opponent. But that was very rare. But then when the new generation, represented by first Ayrton Senna and Michael Schumacher, arrived, they'd been brought up on kart tracks with different ways of behavior. And it was Michael who really, in a sense, codified that into a new kind of etiquette.
I think you're right, and we're going to go through those different facets of Schumacher later in the podcast. But I think that certainly Schumacher, and before him probably two Brits, Stirling Moss and Jackie Stewart, were important steps towards making Formula One or motor racing in general more professional.
Yes, indeed. They behaved like professional drivers, not like the sort of image we have of people from the 30s and the 50s who were kind of amateur gentleman drivers, or so we think of them today, even though some of them, I think, were professional too. But certainly Michael Schumacher was the next step on, and the biggest step, probably the biggest step of all.
Probably. And so in this podcast, we're going to go through all those different ways in which we think Michael Schumacher did revolutionize Formula One. But before we do, Richard, it's probably worth us having a brief chat about the remarkable Schumacher career arc. He wasn't born into a motor racing dynasty at all, was he?
No, he wasn't at all. He didn't have any of the advantages that, people who'd been to public school and had parents with lots of money, or even just parents with garages, as quite a lot of drivers had. He didn't have any of those advantages. His father was a bricklayer in a small town called Hurt in North Rhine-Westphalia. But and Michael got a cart very early on, or got into carts very early on. And when his father saw that he had talent, he took a big step. He went and started a kart track of his own in a town called Kerpen, not far away from where Michael was born. Kerpen is not a particularly well-favoured place. You would never call it fashionable.
Any more than Michael was fashionable.
Any more than Michael was notoriously a style-free zone, I think, for most of his career. But that's okay. He was, there was no pretentiousness about him, that's for sure. And I think that goes back to his beginnings. And, so his father opened a kart track and Michael got a lot of practice there. And, that's really where it all began.
And yes, he was in those days a young mullet-headed genius.
Yes.
But anyway,
in stonewashed jeans,
in stonewashed, snow-washed sometimes even. I think. Anyway, when Michael Schumacher actually got into Formula One, which of course you'll remember he did at Spa in 1991 with Eddie Jordan in the beautiful green 7-Up Jordan, which he qualified 7th on his debut, Formula One debut. And straight away, I think everybody realized, here's a quick boy.
Yep.
Here is a quick guy. And, in fact, so quickly was that realized by all and sundry, and particularly Bernie Ecclestone and Flavio Briatore, that Michael was whisked away from Eddie Jordan's clutches, although he was given a bit of money for that. And then he went to Benetton immediately. And, of course, he did brilliantly at Benetton, won 2 world championships, and then we went into the Ferrari era. And yes, we're talking about an extraordinarily successful driver who just reset the compass point, I suppose, on professionalism and ruthlessness and all these other things that we're going to talk about. But I think we want to start talking about them, do we not?
Yes, we do. And we should talk probably first, because it comes before everything else, about fitness. About the way he prepared himself, his attitude to preparing his body as well as his mind for the business of being a Formula One driver in the 1990s when things were changing.
I think Ayrton Senna was very physically fit, by the way, but in a different way. Yeah. He would run on the beach in Portugal, but Michael approached his fitness training in a different way,
yes,
in a more professional way.
He did. I mean, Sterling Moss had been very keen on fitness. He'd been a rugby player at school and a sprinter, and he kept himself very trim. And then Niki Lauda, especially after his accident.
And Willy Dungal.
Willy Dungal, the Austrian trainer, came in and worked with Lauda quite intensively on fitness and diet and got him back into terrific shape to win another championship. And Dungal also worked with Johnny Herbert and Gerhard Berger and Carl Wendley and Michael in the early days too. And Senna had Nuno Cobra and Joseph Leberer, masseur and nutritionist. And Nuno Cobra made sure that Senna got 8 hours sleep every night and drank a glass of water as soon as he got up. These are very sophisticated preparations. And advised meditation as well, which probably came quite easily to Senna, maybe not so easily to
I remember, of course, the much lamented late Aki Hintsa, who came into McLaren and first of all was working with Mika Häkkinen, fellow Finn, and then most of the drivers, Kimi Räikkönen as well. And this whole thing of fitness and diet and lifestyle and what's called wellness is now something that all sports persons and indeed all Formula One drivers, therefore, have to do. But Michael was absolutely in the vanguard of it. I know you've mentioned Sterling Moss, but I think he was in the vanguard of changing it.
Oh, he certainly was.
And he was the first driver, if you don't mind my saying so, who, he had a very visible and obvious six-pack. I mean, this is and muscles everywhere. He was a fit-looking guy in the same way as, Niki Lauda never was.
Yeah, and muscles particularly in the neck, because that's where a big difference is being made with the way the cars were. They were going through 5 or 6G on corners, and that was putting enormous strain on their neck muscles. So they had to do, they had to devise and special exercises. So, I can't remember which driver it was said, I used to go into a shirt shop and ask for a size 15 shirt, and they'd measure it, and it turned out it was 18, because he'd put on so much muscle around his neck. I don't know if you've ever seen that picture of Mike Tyson from behind, his shoulders and his neck and his head, and you see this astonishing neck that just more or less goes straight down from his ears into his shoulders. And F1 drivers had to get like that, and Michael absolutely led the way on that.
In fact, if you look at Formula One drivers, often they have asymmetrical necks because, of course, most circuits are clockwise.
Yes.
So one side of the neck is a little bit more muscular than the other. Little known fact. Anyway,
like tennis players, Rod Laver, who was left-handed, his left forearm was literally twice the size of his right forearm.
And do you remember Roscoe Tanner, the big serve? His one arm was bigger than the other considerably. But I actually have a story about Michael and his fitness, because I remember when I was a magazine editor, we went down to Fiorano, obviously the Ferrari test track as was, to do a feature. And went down there with photographer and blah, 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 to do a feature on Michael testing. And it was, I suppose, about just a bit more than 20 years ago. John Todd was the team principal, Ross Brawn was there, etc. Anyway, he'd done about 200 laps or something like that. Remember, Fiorano's not a long lap. And the Ferraris were very reliable, so he probably had done literally 200 laps. And I remember, and then he'd done a lot of debriefing with engineers. And I remember walking out of the circuit at about 10:30 in the evening, having got there at 7 in the morning. Long day. But, photographers always like to wait for the light and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we walked out of the circuit, and the little house that Enzo Ferrari built at Fiorano? Well, that was made available for Michael Schumacher, special treatment. And as I walked past, I couldn't resist looking in at the window because I saw a little bit of flickering light and the curtains weren't quite drawn. And I tiptoed up to the window and looked through the gap in the curtains. And I saw the television was on, and Michael, having driven 200 laps and having debriefed at some length with the engineers, was sitting wearing his helmet. And it was a specially adapted weighted helmet with cables on each side reaching out across to pulleys, and each pulley had weights. And he was turning his head from right to left to right to left to right to left as he watched his television program. And that was 10:30 at night, and he was still doing it when I walked away. Dedication.
Was he going vroom vroom at the same time?
Not audibly. Not audibly.
He worked with a man called Balbir Singh, didn't he, for 10 years?
He did.
From his time at Benetton all the way through his Ferrari years. And Balbir Singh was of Indian extraction.
He was,
I
indeed.
think. And he was his physiotherapist. And it was interesting because there was not, at the time, shall we say, not a great deal of diversity in the Formula One paddock.
To be fair, there still isn't.
No, but there's a bit more than there was. But
yes.
Balbir Singh really was unusual in that respect. But he obviously must have been a fantastic physiotherapist to have been retained by Michael for all those years. And he wore a Ferrari uniform, didn't he, in the paddock and the pits when at a Grand Prix meeting.
He did, and I think other drivers began to realise, look, I've got to be like Michael in this sense, and perhaps in other senses as well, which we'll come to, but certainly in terms of fitness. I think also another reason why that was so important is that we weren't just racing at Silverstone and Nürburgring. We were racing in Malaysia, where there was a significantly hotter and more humid climate, and you just had to be fitter to do it.
Yeah. And now, of course, with 24 races, you need recovery protocols and all kinds of things.
And the G-forces are a different order.
Yep, completely. So they all have their, Max and Charles Leclerc and everybody, they all have their own personal trainers now. And that is thanks to Michael, really, I think, who really set the standard for that.
So I think that's one thing we can praise him for. But I'm afraid to say not everything we're going to say in this podcast is going to be entirely positive, because That's not the nature of how one appraises a person. And Michael, great driver, hugely fit, supremely successful, all of those things, but also ruthless. Ruthless. Perhaps also raised ruthlessness to a new level, Richard.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. There had been ruthless drivers before. I mentioned Giuseppe Farina, the first world champion, who was notorious for being, shall we say, careless of his rivals' interests, and would chop across people.
Clay Regazzoni was like that.
Regazzoni was like that, yeah, although he probably calmed down a bit with experience. And one or two others. But they were the exceptions, and they were criticized for it. Or the other drivers knew who they were and kind of avoided them when necessary. But it really began to develop, I think, in the Prost-Senna rivalry, especially with Senna. And it became obvious that drivers who had come up through karting had a different attitude to whether motor racing was a contact sport or not. In karts, you can rub tires, you can bounce off each other. There's going to be no harm coming. Now, we laughed when Villeneuve and Arnoux banged wheels all the way around a lap at Dijon and whenever it was.
79.
79. That was kind of seen as good fun. But it was...
To be fair, I remember John Watson was a bit scathing about it.
Yeah. Well,
but Mario Andretti said it was two young lions clawing each other.
It was. But it was also, it was a breach of what had previously been considered the etiquette of the sport, which was no contact. But contact came in. And because, wheels and tires got bigger, so there's more to bounce off. The cars weren't going to get tangled up together in quite the same way as cars in the 50s or even the 60s would have done. They were more robust. They were safer. So it was easier to bang into each other. So, you had the Prost-Senna altercations, particularly at Suzuka at the end of two seasons in 89 and 90, which seemed pretty horrifying at the time, but, it was part of the drama in a way. But Michael took what Senna had been doing and took that to a new level, I think. They remind me of two tennis players. Senna, to me, was more like McEnroe. With McEnroe, a red mist descended. He felt he was in the right, so somehow he convinced himself he could do anything. And get away with it.
Yeah, he was the you cannot be serious of Formula One.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But Schumacher was more like Jimmy Connors. Connors would do things that were contrary to accepted codes of behavior, but he did it in a very calculated way. He knew exactly what he was doing. He kept cool while he was doing it, which McEnroe didn't. And I think Michael was more like that. Whenever Michael did something that was unacceptable, he did it for a reason, and he knew what the outcome was going to be, and he knew the outcome would be to his advantage. Hence the end of the championship in 1994 with Damon Hill at Adelaide, which I'm sure you remember well.
Certainly do. Yes, I mean that was absolutely ruthless. I mean. It's interesting, of course, there wasn't Twitter or X or social media in those days. Whenever that subject comes up, you're always going to find somebody who says, oh, Damon Hill should have held back and he shouldn't have gone for the gap. Yes, with hindsight, absolutely correct. The point was the gap shouldn't have been closed as Damon legitimately went through. Of course, Damon would have done that differently with hindsight. But Michael knew that his car was crippled. And therefore, he was not going to let Damon go past. Yeah. And that was the ruthlessness that we're talking about, that I must win.
And he'd built that up over the short time he'd been in Formula One by then. He'd established a reputation for himself. And I think that the distinctiveness of his helmet at the time. When other drivers saw, there weren't halos in those days. You could see the driver behind you. You could see his helmet. You knew who it was. And when Michael's helmet came up behind you, you knew that, you were probably going to have to get out of the way or something not very good would happen. And that was a kind of intimidating tactic. Senna had used that a bit, I think. I think Senna knew that he had that kind of power.
I think Senna had the red car with the yellow helmet partly for that reason.
Yes.
He was so visible, and when people saw it in their mirrors, they got the hell out of the way.
Yeah.
And Michael built on that. He absolutely did. And of course, if you do get that reputation, people don't want to tangle with you.
No.
And we've sometimes seen the opposite. Some drivers who perhaps should have fought a little bit harder on track, and therefore other drivers thought were a pushover.
Yeah.
I'll show my nose down into this corner. He'll definitely let me through after you, Claude, type of behaviour. Yeah. Michael, the opposite.
Yeah.
Absolute opposite. I mean, we're talking about ruthless tactics. I think probably the worst I've ever seen, with my own eyes, at a race I was at, which was Hungary. We're going forward now. This is when Michael had made his return and was driving for Mercedes. And his old teammate, not only a teammate, but a teammate who had been extremely loyal to him, Rubens Barrichello, was by that point a Williams driver. And you'll remember what I'm going to talk about. They went down the pit straight at the Hungaroring, and Michael was ahead. Yeah. Michael was ahead, and Rubens was going down the inside.
By the pit wall.
Yeah. Probably with about, 15 centimetres to his right, or 30 centimetres at that point. And Michael just began to chop him into the wall and kept coming and kept coming. And Rubens squeezed up as close as he could to the wall. But Michael wasn't going to give him any room. And they were going flat out. And if they had made serious contact, we would have talked about a plane crash. We don't have to talk about the likely outcome because it's too gruesome to describe in detail. But I remember Jackie Stewart being there at that race, and he was shaking with rage. And he did make some very outspoken comments. And for what it's worth, I was raging. I just thought, we have watched the most appalling thing. Luckily, Rubens was unharmed. But, he wasn't fighting for a world championship. He wasn't even fighting for a race win. What do you think was going through his mind, or what do you think did go through his mind at those moments? Was it the Jimmy Connors cynical thing, or was it a bit of the McEnroe red mist too?
I don't think it was the red mist. I think he knew what he was doing. He had a history with Rubens. They'd been together for a long time in the Ferrari team, and I think he knew that he believed that if there was a number one and a number two in that incident, he was the number one and he was going to come out ahead, even though they were in different teams and they were racing for different things at that point. And you can see it from the camera on Rubens' car, and no matter how many times you watch it, it's absolutely blood-curdling. You're right. It's in terms of one driver inflicting something on another driver, that's as bad as it's got in Formula One, I think.
I think so. And anyway, it was an appalling thing. Luckily, neither of them, by the way, was hurt, because also he wasn't only risking Rubens' life or limb, also his own.
Yeah, well, it was thanks to Rubens that they didn't end up in.
But if Michael had done it on Michael, goodness knows what would have happened. Yeah, no, and the other thing, of course, is that youngsters watched it and thought it was, this wasn't, an also-ran doing it. No. It was then, at that point, the most successful driver in the history of the sport doing it.
Yeah.
And not really getting censured very badly for it in those days, really. I mean, Michael did a lot of things that he didn't get enough punishment for over his whole career. That might be partly a Michael thing, partly a Ferrari thing at the time he was in Ferrari, of course.
Yep. But that ruthlessness was an absolute salient characteristic of his whole career, and it made him, for good and ill, it made him a 7 times champion. There's no doubt about that. You can't take that away.
Absolutely, and it was ruthlessness, win at all costs, And you've mentioned, and we've talked about Adelaide, 94. We've now talked about Hungary. Was it 2012?
2010.
2010. So we talked about those. There's others to talk about. I mean, let's talk about Jerez 97.
Shall we take an ad break first? A quick break, and you can join us in a minute for part 2.
And then we'll kick off with Jerez 97.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
An aspect of Michael Schumacher's ruthlessness was the desire to win at all costs. That's really what it was all about. And we saw that very clearly at Adelaide in 1994 when he came together with Damon Hill in order to win the championship. And then we saw it again in 1997, didn't we, at Jerez with another Williams driver.
Jacques Villeneuve. And the big difference, of course, then is that in 1994 it worked, and in 1997 it did not work. And if you remember the Martin Brundle commentary, he picked it out. He said that, that hasn't worked, my friend. And very obviously, Michael had tried a barge more than a chop, I think, in order to try to damage the Williams and prevent it scoring points to win himself the World Championship. Well, it didn't work because the Williams was slightly damaged, but not mortally. And Jacques Villeneuve went on to finish third, if you recall. Enough points to win the World Championship. And behind a McLaren 1-2. Anyway, it was another absolutely nakedly win-at-all-costs move. There wasn't any pretense in it. I mean, there was later some porky pies told, but there wasn't any actual pretense. And the world was up in arms. It was a professional foul, and he hadn't got away with it.
It was using his car as a weapon, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was like banger racing, in effect, which was not what Formula One Grand Prix racing had been about.
Exactly. And at that corner, it wasn't at high enough speed for it to be akin to the attempted manslaughter on Rubens Barrichello, but it was still a nasty thing to do, and it didn't work for him. But he did, yes, use his car as a weapon, and it didn't work. And if you remember, he was standing at the corner watching, and he didn't go back to the pits for a while. He just stood there watching, and I always wondered what was going through his mind at times like this. We'll get an insight into that in the next ruthless act or win-at-all-costs act that we're going to talk about, which we'll talk about in a minute. But yes, he had obviously tried something on. It hadn't worked. The world had seen what he'd tried. The world had seen that it hadn't worked. The world was by and large pleased that he hadn't made it work this time. I know, by the way, there'll be Michael Schumacher fans listening to this who will be shouting and screaming and doing whatever else they might be doing, getting onto Twitter and saying that we're wrong or I'm wrong or we're both wrong. But actually, it isn't acceptable, and I was pleased it didn't work.
No, I think one of the reasons he knew he could get away with it was that he had built up such an enormous fan following. As Senna had before him. Senna, in the eyes of many, could do no wrong, and any criticism was unacceptable. Michael, through his terrific exploits, had built a giant following. So I suspect he knew that, there'd be a critical mass on his side, whatever he did. But as to what he was thinking when he was standing there, having failed to knock Jacques Villeneuve out of the race, he was probably thinking, I didn't hit him hard enough.
He probably was thinking that. And, one of the problems I always thought about it, one of the weird things I always thought is he didn't need to do it. He was so good that he didn't need to do any of this.
Yep.
He was supremely brilliant as a racing driver. I mean, we've hardly ever seen better. And I think probably in the wet, there's a few you could name. Senna again, Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, a few others. Even now, Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, but right up there, and supremely brilliant driver. And why do this?
Yeah.
Anyway, the next one, I think, is very similar because 9 years later, I mean, there have been other ones, but we can't talk about every single one. But Rascasse, so 2006, there he was, aware, because you get the split times on the steering wheel, well aware that behind him was Fernando Alonso on a quick lap. Pole position absolutely critical at Monaco, of course. It's not like another circuit where he could do something about it. If you're not first on Saturday, you're not going to be first on Sunday. That's what was going through his mind. So he, inverted commas, crashed at Rascasse. Do you know he lost control, apparently? Do you know the speed in kilometers per hour? I'll tell you. 10. 10 kilometers an hour. I'm 61. I can walk faster than that.
Well, he didn't really crash it, did he? He parked it, basically.
Yes. And by the way, again, what he should have done, if he wanted to do that properly, is nerf it into the Rascasse barrier on the apex and knock the front wing off.
Yeah.
That would have been more believable. But that little wiggle that he did at walking pace, literally walking pace, well, brisk walking pace. Absurd. And I was there. Were you there?
No, I wasn't. No, I was watching on the telly there.
Well, I was there, and it was I was still a full-time journalist at the time. And I remember the post-qualifying press conference, FIA press conference. And Michael walked in, and he had form for this kind of thing, which meant not only that the press corps was ready to give him a hard time, but also he was ready. He kind of thought, I know how to handle this. He knew what he'd done, but he also thought I knew how to handle it. But guess what? He didn't. Because I remember there he was, and of course the FIA press conference, there he is with the two other drivers, but no press officer or comms person alongside. No one to say, that's enough. That's enough questions, please, gents, ladies and gentlemen. That's it. Now Michael's got to go to engineering debrief, which is the kind of foolish formulation one uses in such circumstances. And I'm speaking from experience, from my long experience as a comms person. But anyway.
That's making excuses for drivers.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So there he was, just sitting there, answering question after question. And it dawned on him. You could see human frailty in the roar, Richard. You could see it dawn upon this man that he had tried to do something, another professional foul, and then he'd lied about it, and no one was buying the lie at all. And you could just see him thinking, oh my goodness, I think I've got this wrong.
Yeah, and the stewards agreed, didn't they? And
Finally, it took them long enough.
Yeah, and bumped him to the back of the grid, so it didn't work on any level.
Again, it didn't work, and it was interesting. You know, again, Jackie Stewart was there. Jackie Stewart, very outspoken, criticised him. Keke Rosberg, we're talking about all world champions, ex-world champions. Keke Rosberg called him a cheap cheat.
Well, it's a serious stain on his reputation, that one. I mean, there are a few, but that was so blatant and so cheap is a good word, actually. It was something kind of pathetic about it. You know, if you can't take being second on the grid, I know, pole at Monaco, of course, is what everybody wants. But, if you can't, you're a 7-time world champion. If you can't take, starting behind one other car on the grid at Monaco, then, what kind of a champion are you?
Indeed. And if you remember, John Todd was then the boss at Ferrari, and he very outspoken in his criticisms of the FIA for penalising Michael. At that point, I remember thinking he's never going to end up being the president of the FIA, which was already being mooted. But of course he did. Max Mosley was very pro-Todd at the time, but there was rumours in the paddock that what Todd had said had been so inappropriate that there might even be a sanction on Todd for saying it, because you don't criticize the referee in that sense. But and by the way, if Ron Dennis had said it, I'm sure there would have been. But anyway, there wasn't. I think those incidents that we've talked about, these, and there are others, but perhaps we can, limit it to that. Otherwise, we're going to be too negative about a great driver. But they were one of the things that stays in the memory and sticks in the craw.
Yeah. But let's talk about something much more positive, which was his gift for building a team around him, which was a very, very important aspect of his all-round skill at the art of Formula One. You don't get far if you haven't got the support of your team. But he really did take that much further than anybody had before. And he did that through sheer hard work and a willingness to be seen to be working hard. Your glimpse of him with a helmet on and weights, working on strengthening his neck, that was typical of his appetite for hard work. And that could be seen in the pits and the paddock at every race meeting. I have a very vivid memory of being early in his time at Ferrari, being at Imola, one of the practice days, and hanging around long after almost everybody had gone. It got dark. And there he was in the Ferrari garage, sitting on a wheel, talking to the mechanics who were working on it. And I thought, that's a guy who has got an interesting handle on how you go about this business. He's not back at the hotel. He's not having dinner, at that nice restaurant just outside the gates at Imola. He's pitching in with the mechanics, talking their language. And I think all mechanics, maybe particularly Ferrari, respond to that. And that was his modus operandi. Get them on your side, show them. And then, they work hard for you. You go out and you show them, you can take half a second off the time that, from your last set of laps. You show them you can capitalize on the work that they've done. And that's what builds the bond, isn't it?
He was brilliant at it. He was the best at it. He realized that bringing the team around him, which also means not around the teammate, was crucial. And there was lap time in it. And that means engineers and mechanics. By the way, one of the first people who did that was Juan Manuel Fangio, who used to share his prize money with his mechanics, and lo and behold had very reliable cars, by and large. So it was only, another all-time great, obviously, Fangio, and Schumacher, an all-time great. And I remember Steve Matchett, who is now an author and broadcaster, a successful one, an excellent one, in Formula One, but started off as a mechanic at Benetton. And he wrote his transition from mechanic to author, or media personality now you could say, was the book he wrote called A Mechanic's Tale, which was about his time at Benetton. And he is glowing in his descriptions of Michael. And it's all around what you've talked about. It's the fact that when Michael won a race, or did well, he made every mechanic feel that their contribution had been crucial. And Steve Matchett always said to me, I have never felt so much part of a victory as when Michael won. And it is a team game. When you work in Formula One, you realize it's a team game. You don't get that impression quite so much if you're watching it on the telly. But if you're in the team, you realize there are hundreds of us, and there's two people who have got to do an absolutely fantastic job at the end of what we've all done. And he actually lived and breathed that and made those who worked so hard from dawn till dusk, later than dusk, in those pre-curfew days, really believe in it. And he knew everybody's name. He didn't ever call anyone mate. He always knew whether they were John or Dave or Steve. I'm talking about at Benetton days. Yep. He knew their wives' names. He knew their girlfriends' names. If one of them he would surprise them. Steve once told me this. Steve Matchett once told me that he'd overheard Michael going up to one of the mechanics and saying, "How's Johnny?" or Dave or Steve, I can't remember the name. He meant the mechanic's son, because the mechanic's son had broken his leg playing football. And Michael didn't only remember to ask how the mechanic's son was, but remember the mechanic's son's name in so asking. And I don't think he had a file where he quickly reminded himself of the name and went up and then asked. He remembered. He saw these people as equals whom one should work with to achieve victory.
I think that must have had something to do with his background, coming from such a modest circumstances. When you make it and you either go one way or the other, you either continue to recognize the value of the people you came up among, or you divorce yourself from it. And I think he stayed. He could talk to the mechanics, as you say, as an equal, or treat them as equals. And
but he was a working class boy himself. Yeah, he was. Apparently, he speaks German in an accent that Germans would recognise as a regional accent. In that sense.
But of course, particularly at Ferrari, he was in a perfect team. Jean Todt brought in Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne, who'd worked with Michael at Benetton, and Nigel Stepney as chief mechanic, and his race engineers, Luca Baldessari, and then Chris Dyer. They were all very close to each other. They were very tight and working towards the same goal, which wasn't always the case at Ferrari. And it was very clear who was the number one driver. And, Eddie Irvine or Rubens Barrichello, they were the number two, and they had to accept.
Or Felipe Massa later.
Massa later on, exactly.
And that pattern has, it doesn't always work, and not every team goes for it. I mean, current Red Bull team obviously operates like that.
Yep.
And it works for them, but, Lewis Hamilton usually had a teammate he had to, particularly when he had Rosberg. But anyway, we're getting off the point. I'm getting off the point. Michael also worked harder. He worked harder and longer into the night.
Yeah.
And I think I never worked with Michael, but I did work with Sebastian Vettel for 2 years at Aston Martin at the end of his career, Formula One career. And of course, to some extent, Michael took Sebastian under his wing, both German drivers, and Michael recognized in Seb, this could be, heir to my mantle of number one German. And indeed, he did become that. And I think Michael said to Seb, "You've just got to work hard. You've just got to work hard." And Seb did it. Even at the very end of 2022, Seb's last year at Aston Martin, and coincidentally mine as well, I was working with him there. But he'd always be last. He'd always be debriefing with the mechanics and engineers long after half the rest of the people had gone back to the hotel.
Yeah.
And I think Seb has tried to repay that mentorship role to Mick, or did try to, Michael's son. But anyway, they both of them had this incredible work ethic, but it came from Michael.
I have one very vivid memory of the day that the 1996 Ferrari Formula One car was launched at Fiorano. And in those days, launches were kind of gala occasions, and especially at Ferrari. And there were a lot of people there, and a lot of the old guard for Ferrari, Ugolini and Scaglietti and all the guys who'd been friends with Enzo. There were a lot of people there. Michael was there. Irvine was there. The new car designed by John Barnard was there. A helicopter came out of the sky carrying Luca Di Montezemolo and Gianni Agnelli. All the top brass were there. It was great. And, Gianni Agnelli said, well, we should enjoy this car. After all, it hasn't lost a race yet, which seemed like a typically fatalistic Ferrari view.
Yeah.
Anyway, there was ceremonies, press conference and so on. And then people started leaving as the afternoon went on. Some people stayed around. And Michael stayed because he was going to run the car. Nobody made an announcement of that, but he was. So there were a few people stayed on. The mechanics were working on it, getting it ready. And eventually, by the time Michael went out, it was almost dusk. And he did lap after lap after lap, hammering away. And it was marvelous. It was poetry. You could see the brake discs lighting up in the gloom as he went round Fiorano. He won 3 races that year, even though it wasn't a terribly good car. But I did think, watching him going round and the work ethic and the feeling, you could see that was engendering in the team already. This is going to go well.
And yes, 3 race wins that year, including, I think, one of the greatest we've ever seen, actually, in Barcelona in the wet.
In the rain, indeed, yeah.
Unbelievably good win. I mean, Sterling Moss watching, just saying, what a magnificent performance. I'm going to tell one little story before we go to a break, if I may, which is still on this subject of team building. A bit later in his career at Mercedes, and you know Andrew Shovlin, Shove, as they call him, race engineer at Mercedes. And I remember once sitting on a plane. I was working for McLaren, and I found myself sitting on a plane next to Shove. And we were talking about this, that, and t'other drivers that we worked with. So I was talking about Hamilton and Alonso and Button. He was talking about mainly Schumacher. And he said, I remember one time Michael invited us all to his kart track, because he continued to own the Kirpen kart track all the way through. And all the engineers were taken down there, and Michael, raced them all and showed them how to get the best out of a kart. And absolutely, Shove said it was like he was just one of us. And he wanted it to be like that. And it wasn't posh, and we had sandwiches, and then we got in the karts again. And he was absolutely like that. So on the one hand, he was completely like that. But then Shove told me this funny story, which just reminded them all how extremely different they were. Because, of course, by that time, Michael Schumacher was a multi-millionaire. And they were chatting over a couple of beers and sandwiches after they'd finished messing around with the karts. And one of them said, Michael, have you got a helicopter? And Michael said, no, I have no helicopter. And then they carried on talking. And about 5 minutes later, Michael said, oh, no, I do have one, yes. And I just thought, imagine not remembering if you have a helicopter or not, Richard. Do you have a helicopter? I think
I do not. But, yeah. But he was, he was the first sporting billionaire.
He was. He was rich enough to forget
the air is pretty thin
that he had a helicopter. That's pretty rich. Shall we, on that note, go to a break? So we've talked about the many ways that Michael Schumacher has revolutionized Formula One, and he really did revolutionize Formula One. And by the way, those who practice it well and win continue to use the techniques and attitudes that he adopted. But we've talked about his fitness, we've talked about his ruthlessness, we've talked about his win-at-all-costs mentality, we've talked about his extraordinary and very impressive ability in team building to bring a team around him, mechanics, engineers, everyone. But he had this relentless mindset, and I don't mean this as a negative, I mean this as a positive. Let me contrast him with someone who he's often compared to, which is Ayrton Senna, and perfectly understandable and correct that they should be compared to brilliant drivers that were both relentless in their mindset around winning. But if you remember in the winter, Senna used to jet away and hang out on the beach and do whatever he wanted to do in Portugal or Brazil.
Read the Bible.
I don't think Michael did a lot of Bible reading, although he was actually a Catholic, or is a Catholic, I should say. But anyway, Michael didn't do any of that. I mean, Eddie Irvine, when he was his teammate, couldn't get a look in at Fiorano, couldn't do any testing. Michael pounded around doing it all. I mean, there was no element of a Formula One driver's craft or workload that man wasn't prepared to shoulder.
No, and it was all to the end of performing. And what he proved time and again was that he could perform when the moment came. Ross Brawn would ask him, I think it was at Buenos Aires in 1998. He went on the radio to him and said, "Michael, we need you to make up 12 seconds in 5 laps starting now." And he did. He just did it.
And he did a similar thing in Hungary in 98. Famously doing, was it a 3-stop strategy? They converted it to that. And again, Michael said, "I need some qualifying laps."
Yep.
And he produced them.
Yep. To order and for as long as they were required, which is extraordinary.
I mean, we shouldn't forget. I mean, we've talked about Michael, and we do. Whenever you talk about Michael, you end up talking about negatives as well as positives, because that's the nature of the beast. But he was an absolutely brilliant driver.
Yeah. Ross said a couple of other interesting things about him. He said that in computer language, Michael has a very large disk space and a very good search engine. Which is another way of saying how professional he was, I think, but also how large his capacities were for all the tasks that a racing driver has to accomplish.
And I saw that. I remember once being in a group of journalists, the huddles that one has, and we all put our recording devices, dictaphones as we used to call them. Now everyone uses their iPhone, but never mind. We have these bulky recording devices, put them in an arc in front of them, probably 20 of us. Anyway, I remember a young journalist, asked him a question. We were all in a big group, and he asked him the question, and Michael said, "I've noticed that the red light on your recording device has come on, so obviously you need to replace the batteries. I'll take another question while you replace the batteries." And duly another question was asked. And the poor young journalist was fidgeting, desperately for his batteries. Michael was quite right. But that kind of bandwidth to notice, it might seem like a small thing, but it's a kind of depth of peripheral vision and alertness that he had at all times. And I remember when I was the editor of a magazine called F1 Racing at the time, and we had a thing called Man of the Year. And obviously nicked off the Radio 4 Today programme. And Man of the Year consisted of who was the Man of the Year, who won it. It was voted for by readers. But it was also Driver of the Year, Qualifier of the Year, Team Principal of the Year, Designer of the Year, Pit Crew of the Year, this and that of the year. Anyway, Michael usually won quite a few of those things because it was during the time in the early part of this century where he was winning everything. Anyway, we didn't take trophies, but we took beautiful Darren Heath photographs. Darren Heath, great photographer. And we framed photographs, and we'd have a photograph of the driver or the qualifier or the pit crew, and it would say Driver of the Year 2003 or whatever it was. Anyway, we had them made and took them down to the last race, which was usually Suzuka at that time, and we would present them, and there'd be a photograph of the winner holding up the winning trophy, which was actually a photograph. It was about the 3rd, 4th year we'd been doing it, and Michael had about 3 wins, probably Driver of the Year, Man of the Year, and Qualifier of the Year, or something like that. And he said, "Oh, they're smaller." I said, No, not smaller at all. He said, "No, I'm sure they're smaller." Anyway, and they were big. They were A4 photographs in nice big frames with a big mount. So they were probably bigger than A3 by the time they'd been framed. So big old bulky things. And anyway, our art director back at the ranch in Teddington, near London, West London, he rang me in the evening to say, "Did everything go okay with all your presentations?" I said, "Yeah, everything went well. We gave Kimi his one, and we gave Juan Pablo his one, and Michael said something odd. He said, 'They're bigger.' How weird." He said, he didn't say that, did he? I said, "Yeah." He said, "I think they're about 3 mil wider." Now, he hadn't seen them for a year, and I don't think he'd ever paid any attention to them at all. It's remarkable. Yeah. Spatial awareness stroke genius.
I think Ross again paid a great tribute to Michael's exceptional qualities when he said, when Eddie Irvine was the number 2 at Ferrari, he said, Eddie is the true barometer of where we are with the car. In other words, what Michael brings to it is something beyond the car's natural capacity and something that nobody else could bring to it, which is a pretty great tribute. And that, of course, was with the team that Michael had helped to, whose fortunes he'd helped to restore when he went to Ferrari.
I mean, absolutely restore. Famous statistic, Jody Scheckter won the World Championship for Ferrari in 1979 and the Drivers' World Championship, and it was 21 long years until that was repeated by Michael. I know they won the Constructors in 1999, but they didn't win the Drivers again until 2000. 21 years. I mean, by the way, they're cruising for a repeat of that at the moment. Wow. But it was an extraordinary thing. And not only did he win it, he then won it again in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. And 2 of those seasons, of course, he had a great car, but 2 of those seasons, 2002 and 2004, were right up there with among the most dominant we've ever seen, weren't they?
They were indeed exceptional. And, it was coming from a very low base. They'd been through that era in the early 90s. They went 3 years in a row without winning any Grand Prix at all in the era of Prost and Alesi and Berger. And then Berger won 1 in 94 and Alesi won 1 in 95. Alesi, who looked like he was going to become one of the great, when he went there, looked like he was going to be one of the great Ferrari drivers. I mean, whoever looked more like a Ferrari driver than Jean Alesi? He had the talent, he had just everything about it.
Everything.
The name.
Yes. He should have gone with Giovanni, really.
Yeah. I remember him telling me how persecuted he was at school in France for his Italian name. They called him Jean Spaghetti. So I think he was a bit sensitive about that. But, why would it not work for Jean Alesi and it would work for Michael Schumacher immediately afterwards? Well, there are lots of reasons for that, and we've been talking about very many of them. But
it wasn't for a lack of talent. Jean Alesi was right up there.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it was all those other things, the relentlessness, the ruthlessness, the ability to build the team, the work ethic, the fitness. Not that Alesi was lacking at all. He was a terrific Formula One driver, but Michael brought something extra to each of those dimensions. And it galvanized Ferrari, didn't it? I mean, of course, Jean Todt was there controlling it and bringing in Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne and the others. And, a guy like nobody ever talks about called Tad Zapsky, who had been with them at Benetton, who was in charge of the electronic control systems, which were quite a significant factor at Benetton, and as we know, and then later on at Ferrari.
Slightly controversial figure.
Very controversial. But, clever guy.
Very clever guy.
In at the heart of the team. Didn't seek any personal glory. But that just shows what an amazingly well-integrated and efficient team was built there. And they all pitched in. I remember Ross used to take the pit stop practice, and between practice sessions, he'd be there with a stopwatch. The mechanics would be rolling the car up, doing the pit stop routine, and Ross would be standing there going, 7.2, 7.2 seconds, and then so on. And everybody rolled their sleeves up in that team.
And there was no office hours. The opposite of an office hours mentality. I remember once interviewing Jean Todt, and in his office in Maranello back in those days, and he said that he would usually, not sometimes, but usually get a phone call from Michael at 11 o'clock at night. How was your day? Anything I need to know? What's been happening with whatever they were working on, innovation, blah blah blah. And this wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. To ring people at something to midnight routinely. But that's what he did. He just saw it as a 24/7 profession, which he did extraordinarily well.
And it takes some strength of mind to be able to cope with being at the center, being the focal point of something like that, of that restoration of Ferrari's fortunes, the Renaissance and the rebuilding, and then the level of success that they achieved season after season after season.
Season after season. And then obviously they didn't continue to win in 2005 and 2006. Tyres had a bearing. But some of Michael's races in 2005 and 2006 particularly, sensational, including his last race in Brazil. Was it Brazil, his last race in 2006?
I think it was, yeah.
Sensational, carving his way back through the field.
Yeah, Interlagos. Yes.
Interlagos. And, one of the great circuits, by the way, Interlagos.
Proper racetrack,
proper race driver, driving a proper race on what should really have been his last race.
Yes, I think that's probably true. I mean, he stepped away and then came back, and he came back with Mercedes, and you could see the attraction of that to him as well as to Mercedes. Mercedes, wonderful to have the great German 7-time champion there. And he was in their ads for road cars, as soon as the deal was made. But it was an unwise decision. And it's hard to say why, isn't it? That somehow the edge had gone. The team, although Ross Brawn was there and was building it up, they weren't ready to win yet. But Michael, I think, was past the point where he could give that team what he'd given to Ferrari. And no wonder, it was a generation later.
He was 41 as well. And obviously we can see now that Lewis Hamilton is near as damn it 40. And by the way, he will be 40 when he first races a Ferrari. And Fernando Alonso still, who's well into his 40s. Both of them driving brilliantly. At the moment, but they hadn't taken a break in the immediate run up to that age. I think it's one thing to race all the way through till 40-odd. It's a different thing to stop when you're in your mid-30s and then try to kick off again when you're in your early 40s, and that's what Michael did. His teammate was Nico Rosberg, was 24, and that is quite a big difference. Nico Rosberg, I think, a very underrated driver, but he was 17 years younger than Michael.
Yeah. So, in a way, it was not surprising that it didn't work in the way that they must have hoped it would have done. But, for heaven's sake, he left the sport in the end with 7 world championships and 85 Grand Prix wins.
91.
91, beg your pardon. 91, sorry.
91, and lots of other records. And we hadn't really planned to say this, but I'm going to ask you. Where does he rank? I mean, I'm going to give you some thinking time because I'm going to say myself that I've always said that that through the years there was Juan Manuel Fangio, Jim Clark and Ayrton Senna. And you might, if you want to, add Lewis Hamilton to that now because of the sheer magnum opus. But you've probably got to add Michael to it as well as a top 5, have you not?
Yes, absolutely. I would add Max Verstappen.
I think very, very defensible addition.
Yeah. I mean, I know, you want somebody to be a great champion. You want them to win in two different kinds of cars, I think, which Michael did and Fangio did and, others. Lewis.
Fangio in 4.
4 different. Yes.
Yeah.
That's a kind of purist's view. And certainly that applies to drivers who are lucky enough to win championships in Adrian Newey's cars. You'd like to see how they get on with somebody else's. But I think, Max was brilliant with an Adrian Newey car before the Adrian Newey car was absolutely brilliant. But, Michael, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, for all the reasons that we've spoken about. Michael revolutionized Formula One and deserves his place at the very top table.
And that feels like a very good time to wrap things up. Look, I really enjoyed that chat. I hope you did, Richard, and I hope anybody who's listening did too. In fact, we hope that you'll enjoyed it so much that you'll tune in next week when we tackle our next topic.
And in the meantime, if you're enjoying the show, and we very much hope that you are, please do follow or subscribe to the feed so that you never miss an episode. Or even better, tell a friend about it if you think they'd enjoy it.
And if you want to get in touch with us, and we'd love to hear from you, you can drop us a line on podcasts@the-race.com, or you can drop Richard or me a message on Twitter or X. I'm at @thebishf1 and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
Until the next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.
And philosophy, that's history.
The Athletic.